Hey, I'm Cromwell, and this is the beginner's video for remeshing meshes that are put out by photogrammetry software. Essentially what we're going to be doing is we're going to take a mesh from Meshroom. In my case, if you're using another photogrammetry software, that's perfectly fine. This should work for you as long as you don't have any glaring issues with the mesh, such as giant holes or chunks missing out of it. This obviously won't fix that. However, if you do have a mostly complete mesh and you're looking to optimize it by lowering the poly count or making it watertight for 3D printing, or just generally optimizing it for use in some sort of real-time application, whether that be in a game engine, a VR experience, or uploading it online in a 3D model viewer, this should hopefully help you. Now keep in mind that this is the beginner video, so this is aimed at people who have really never used Blender before, so I'm going to go kind of slow. I'm going to explain all of the things that I'm working with. I'm going to talk about some basic 3D concepts so that beginners can kind of follow along and kind of get their bearings about them in 3D, so hopefully this will help them along. And then if you're looking for a more advanced video, simply click on the other video. I'll have the link in the description, so that way you can follow along at a faster pace if you already have your bearings about you inside of 3D. Essentially what we're doing is we're taking a complicated and dense mesh that has hundreds of thousands of polygons and triangular faces, and we are going to simplify it. We're going to smooth it. We're going to take all of the textures and images, the materials and image textures, more accurately, on the surface of it, and we're going to combine them down into one material that has one texture on one model that has been simplified for use in a 3D application. So follow along with me. Here we are in Blender version 2.81. I would suggest using version 2.80 or 2.81 since the older versions of Blender have some stuff in different places and map to different hotkeys. So as long as you're following along, you're more than welcome to follow step by step, and hopefully this will get you where you need to go. One more warning I want to kind of place with this video is that this method is not really appropriate for a full in-depth production workflow. So if you need a model that needs to be readied for rigging and animation, that's going to have a vastly different workflow that requires a lot more time and attention than I can really cover in the scope of this video. And so I'm going to say try to find other resources out there. I may end up doing a video covering that sort of thing in the future, but for the scope of this video, we are going to be retopologizing this mesh with a remesh method that's going to create some uneven topology, but will be suitable for static meshes or perhaps a prop that can be picked up and rotated around in the scene. We've seen quite a bit of that in some video games as of late. And as long as the object doesn't need to animate or deform in any way, this should be more than appropriate for you and for use in those applications that I've listed before. So without further ado, let's kind of jump into this. So really quickly, what I want to do is make sure that my screencast keys are operating, just so that you can see the keys that I'm pressing and follow along in that way in case you're confused about what it is that I'm doing. I will, however, try to call out everything that I'm pressing. So now that we've got that out of the way, I'm going to go to the File menu. So this is kind of our standard Blender File menu at the top. We do have some different layouts up here, which come in the form of tabs. So currently we're in the Layout tab. We have Modeling, which changes a few things over here, as well as some of the options that we have available to us, which will change depending on what we have selected in the scene. Currently, there's nothing in the scene because I've cleaned everything out of my scene. For you, there will most likely be a cube and a light, probably up over here, and a camera, something like, let's see, over here. So it'll look like something like this. They'll be rotated. I've already deleted this out of my scene. So I start with a clean scene every time I do a video tutorial. For you, you're going to have all these elements in your scene, and so what we want to do is press the A key, which for some reason, why are my screencast keys not working? Please work. Okay, there we go. So I press the A key to select everything, and then I'm going to press the X key and hit delete. You can find those options over here. So select all is A, and then select none is Control or Alt A. Sorry, not Control A, but Alt A. And then to invert your selection is Control I. So if we selected one of those and we hit Control I, it's going to select the other two and deselect that one that we had selected. That's kind of how that works. Alternatively, we can also, if I add another object back into the scene, I do that with Shift plus A, you can see there. If I add another object in, I can also simply hit the delete key on the keyboard. This is something that's kind of new to Blender. The previous old workflow required you pressing the X key. And so that's a little bit faster, and if that's more comfortable for you, you're more than welcome to use that. The old way, which is what I've got kind of burned into my memory at this point, is X and then delete. So it's one more extra step, but you go pretty quickly. It'll be fine. I'm going to return back to the layout menu because it did switch to begin with. There's also a sculpting menu, which changes some stuff. We're going to look at that very briefly. We have a UV editing menu. We're going to look at that briefly. A texture paint menu. We're also going to take a short look at that. And a shading menu, which is something that we're going to look at briefly as well. Now, I know this seems like a lot of stuff. Just bear with me. I'm going to walk you through it step by step in this video. In the other video, I'm going to kind of gloss over which layouts I'm using because that'll be more advanced. But here, I'll walk you through it step by step. I'll explain it. And as long as you follow along with everything that I'm doing, feel free to rewind and pause as much as you want. You should be able to get where we're going. And then if you have any questions at any time, feel free to leave them down in the comment section. If you're one of my students in class at the university, you're more than welcome to send me an email and ask me questions. I'm more than happy to help you in that regard. So let's go back to the layout setting up here. And this is primarily what we're going to be working with. And what this allows us to do is to add objects into the scene and kind of move them around and orient us. Of course, any of the other layouts that we have here will enable us to do more or less the same thing. They're just different configurations of the Blender windows. So, for example, to give you a preface to this, in the upper right hand corner, you'll see if I hover my mouse over there, it turns into a crosshair, and then same with the lower left hand corner. And what this essentially means is I can click and I can drag out a new window, and I can change this window to a number of different editor types. And so basically what each of these are is a different configuration of editor types that allow us to do different things inside of Blender. And again, I'm going to show you a look at what that means and how we do that. Alternatively, actually, Blender has now added functionality for each of the corners, which is actually really nice. Before, it used to only be, I believe, the bottom left and the upper right, but we can actually do it in any of the four corners, which is really cool. So, hey, I even learned something today. Great. Now, if we want to collapse one of these windows, and this is kind of a funny thing that I see with a lot of Blender users, they'll do something like this. They'll go, oh, I wanted to close it. Oh, no. And they'll make like all of these extra windows that they don't need. So what you can do is if you hover over to get the crosshair, if you click and drag, you'll see that you get this kind of gray faded window, and there's actually a little arrow here, and you'll probably see that when we get closer to the bottom. You just click and drag, and there's that arrow I was talking about, and you can kind of just collapse them over in on each other. Also worth noting is that your Blender will probably open up with something like this, and you'll have this timeline editor at the bottom. Again, I like to pre-configure my Blender so that way it's kind of the way I like to work with it every time it opens up, and so I've already pre-collapsed that window down there. So if you saw that to begin with, don't worry, I just closed mine because we're not going to be doing any animation, so we don't need a timeline. And so get your windows situated however is comfortable for you. If you're familiar with the Blender workflow or not, just get used to kind of navigating these different windows and what they do, and you'll have your bearings about you in Blender in no time. All right, so with that out of the way, what we need to do now is we need to get our photogrammetry mesh inside of Blender, finally, right? So we're going to go to the File menu, and we're going to say File, Import, and we're going to do the option which is wavefront.obj. Now this is probably the #1 most common 3D file format that exists today. And the other one that's really common is called FBX. This is .fbx. This is a file format that is proprietary to Autodesk, which is a big 3D company or a big 3D software manufacturing company. They make very well-known industry standard software such as Autodesk Maya or Autodesk 3D Studio Max, and they've been around for a long time, but this file format is proprietary to them. So as you probably know, Blender is free and open source, and somehow they've managed to get some sort of FBX importation setup going on inside of Blender, although sometimes it's kind of wonky because Autodesk holds the propriety of this file format, and therefore it's kind of difficult for people who are doing open source licensing to work around Autodesk's license on this file format. If you don't understand what I just said, that's perfectly fine. But just know that there are different 3D file formats. Some of the other ones you'll see are Collada, which is .dae. This can contain some animation data. A very common one that's taking, well, not very common, but a more common one that's taking prevalence now is the Alembic, which is usually used as a larger file caching format. So that's .abc. And then we have BVH, which is motion capture. We're not going to be dealing with that. Scalable vector graphics. So if you create an SVG file from Illustrator, you can actually import that into Blender and turn that from a 2D vector format into a 3D object, which is pretty cool. I might make a video on that at some later point. There's also the Stanford file format, or .ply. This one you might actually see with some photogrammetry software. Another good piece of photogrammetry software that I would like to cover on this channel, and I will hopefully do so soon, is Colmap, and I believe Colmap has the ability to put out .ply format. So that might be something that we see in the future with photogrammetry and perhaps a little bit of 3D printing type stuff. And speaking of 3D printing, we have .stl, which is a common 3D printing file format. There is FBX again, and then we have GLTF, which is taking a little more prominence now. This is another kind of open source file format, and people are trying to get this adopted more readily in the 3D world. So we have .glb and .gltf, and in the GLB version, I believe you can embed textures and perhaps even animations. I'm not sure how that works. I don't think it's perfected quite yet, but the goal is to have GLTF include animations and image textures. We have OBJ, which doesn't typically import image textures. For us, fortunately, it will, because Meshroom generates another file called the .mtl. So for whatever format you're using, if you happen to know which file format your photogrammetry software puts out, just find it here. If it's not here, unfortunately, there's not really a way to import it unless you find some sort of add-on for Blender that allows you to import different file formats. And then the last one, which I'm not really concerned with, is this X3D extensible. We're not going to look at that. For our case, we want the wavefront.obj. So we're going to click that. I'm going to navigate to my file, which is going to be in my texturing folder. For those of my students who are following this workflow from Meshroom, you're going to look for your Meshroom cache folder. Inside of that is going to be the texturing folder. Now I've removed this from the Meshroom cache folder because I don't need all those other files, and so I simply have the texturing folder. So I'm going to enter that, and then inside you should find a folder that has a long string of letters and numbers. You may or may not have more than one of these in here depending on how many times you tried to mesh your object inside of Meshroom. So say you had your Meshroom file and you tried to mesh your object and it didn't work out quite the way you wanted to the first time, and instead of creating a new file, you tried to do it again in the same file. It's possible that Meshroom might have created an additional file that has a long string of letters and numbers for its name. So simply find the correct one. In our case, there's only this one, so I'm going to double click that. And then I have inside here the .mtl, which contains the material settings for that .obj, which was created, thankfully, by Meshroom. And then the actual obj itself, which contains all of the mesh data that was generated by Meshroom. Now, if we were to look at this folder inside of my File Explorer here in Windows, what we would find are most likely three, maybe more than that, I'm not sure, but it's probably three in this case, three Meshroom specific files that are named something like log, status, and something else. We're not worried about those. And then we'd see the OBJ and the MTL. And then in this case, I happen to know that there are also 6 image texture files associated with these two files in this folder. Now, they're not showing up inside of this Blender file view because we're specifically filtering for the .obj file. So in this case, I happen to know that those 6 PNG images are in there. If in your case they're not in there, you're going to want to add them, because when I import this OBJ into Blender, which I'll do right now, that MTL is going to tell Blender when we create the material for this object to link those image files with the mesh. And so if I zoom in, you can see that there's no image, but that's because we're in a view which is called solid shading. And so if I hit the Z key, we can open up our shading menu here, and I want to go into material preview. For those of you who are working with Blender 2.80 or before that, it's going to be called something like Look Dev. I think in 2.7 it was also called Material. But in Blender 2.80, this will be called Look Dev. It'll just have a different name. It'll be the same thing, just with a different name. And if I click that, you'll see that this will turn silver, and then it'll start to add all these materials and images into the memory. And you can see that now I have my plushy Pikachu with all of its textures and its materials mapped to the surface of the mesh. So if I didn't have those PNG textures inside the folder, what would happen is this would either look exactly like this as a solid, or perhaps it would be pure white instead of gray, or even worse, this might show up as a bright pink or purple, pinkish purple, bright kind of neon pink color, which is basically Blender's way of telling you, hey, there's supposed to be an image associated with this material, but it's not here. And so in that case, you would have to do one of two things. You would either have to manually relink the textures inside of your material properties, which can be kind of tedious depending on the number of materials you have. I happen to know, if we take a look here, this is the properties panel. This will give us data about our world scene. It'll give us data about whatever mesh we have selected and whatever tool we have selected. Here I want to go down to this little circular button, making sure that the mesh is selected. And I'm going to press that, and it's going to show me 6 materials that I have associated with this mesh. So if I go back into my material preview, you can see I've got 6 materials associated here. And that means if I didn't have those 6 image textures in that folder, each one of these is going to be missing that image. And I'm going to have to go into each one of these, and I'm going to have to find the right texture, and I'm going to have to link it back into there. So the easy way around that is to make sure that those image textures are inside of your folder before you try to import this thing into Blender. Otherwise, you may have a bit of a tedious task on your hands in order to rectify that problem. So make sure that you have your image textures in there. Later on, I'm going to show you how to pack your image textures into the Blender file, so that way when you move your Blender file, your textures go with the file. Now, if you for some reason save this Blender file and you move it away from where those images are, because what Blender's doing is it's taking a reference to where that file is located on your computer. In specific, wherever I imported that from is where Blender's going to look for that. If you take this Blender file and you move it to another computer, or if you move those image files out of the folder and you place them somewhere else and you try to open this back up again, what's going to happen is this is going to turn bright hot pink, and it's going to say there's supposed to be image textures associated with this file, but I don't know where they are. They've been moved to a different location, or I can't find them on this computer. And so either you're going to have to relink them or figure some way around it. So it's important that you follow along, and when I get to the point of packing texture images into the Blender file, you make sure that you do that. Otherwise, you're going to lose your textures and you're going to have a bad time, and I don't want that for you. So make sure that you're following along and paying attention to this, and hopefully it will get you where you need to be going. And then again, for those of you who are sick of hearing me rant and rave about all this beginner stuff because you're better at using Blender, or you've been more caught up to speed in what I'm talking about, simply go to the advanced video and stop watching this. All right, so what we need to do now that we've kind of gotten all that out of the way, is we need to center our mesh in the world. So let me talk a little bit about the 3D world space, since this is the beginner video, and explain to you exactly what's going on here. So we have this mesh that's been imported, and Meshroom has itself kind of determined where it wants to put the mesh in the 3D world and all that, and we'll look at kind of fixing some of the Meshroom tried to do its best, essentially. It tried to orient this object in the world, but you can see that it came in upside down and kind of rotated around and offset from the center. We're going to fix that. But first, let's get a command on what this 3D world is doing. And so if you're familiar with geometry or trigonometry, or perhaps the Cartesian, coordinate system, you probably already know what this is. But for those of you who aren't, I need to explain it. So we have 2 axes that we're seeing here. There are actually really 3. One of them is hidden, but we have 2 axes. And for those of you who are familiar with the geometry that you've done in perhaps the earlier education of your life, we have the X, which is the red, and the Y, which are the green axes. So the red and green axes here are what we're looking at. And of course, these have values that are mapped onto them, and they kind of denote a grid system upon which points can be placed. Well, we're dealing with 3-dimensional space. So we actually have 3 axes. It just so happens that Blender turns off the 3rd one. I can turn that on so you can visualize it there. And so we have a 3-dimensional space with all these different quadrants within which we can kind of map and place points, or more specifically in this case, vertices that connect to each other, creating edges, and those edges, once connected together, are going to create faces or triangles or polygons or quads. So a quad is obviously made up of 4, a triangle is made up of 3, a face is just any number of them. It can be even more than 4, which typically we don't want to do, but there are some exceptions for that, of course. And so we have all of these elements that are comprising this 3D object that we're looking at here. And kind of the easiest way I can show you is if I zoom in and press the Z key and go to wireframe. If I zoom in really close, you can see that we have all these little triangles and all these little points that are making up this object. Specifically, we have 209,346 of them. And you can see that down here in the right-hand corner. It tells us verts. We have 209,000 of them, which comprise 417,000 faces and triangles. So faces and triangles are essentially the same thing, although if these weren't all triangles, that count may be a little bit different depending, because if you have a quad instead of a tri, that's going to be a 4-sided face, and so we're going to have twice as many triangles as we have quads, because every quad is 2 triangles. That's simply how 3D works. Just if you're not familiar with it, maybe dig into it a little bit deeper. There are a number of 3D courses and things like that out there. I don't want to waste too much time trying to get into the minutia of it, but essentially that's what we're looking at. We're looking at points that are plotted out on a grid that has 3 axes. That's what we're doing. If at any time you get kind of confused about which axis you're looking at, you've got this widget up here in the upper right-hand corner, which kind of denote for you the directions of the axes. So red is the x-axis, y is the green axis, and z is the blue up and down axis. And so as I move around in the scene using my middle mouse button, you can see that widget kind of updates to show you exactly which axes you're looking at. That can be really helpful there if you're brand new to the 3D system. I'm going to hide the z-axis, which is off by default, and the reason we do that is simply because in the 3D perspective view, and you can tell what view you're in here in the upper left-hand corner, having that extra axis is sometimes confusing and just kind of gets in the way. Another thing to note is that in other 3D programs, sometimes the X and Z, or not X, I'm sorry, the Z and Y axes are switched. And so in Blender, we have a Z up axis. And you have 2 different kind of grid formats, which are called the left and the right hand grid. To be completely frank with you, I don't actually remember which one is which, because I don't really need to think about it all that often in the work that I do. And again, that's information that's readily accessible with a quick Google search if you're really interested in the minutia of it. But essentially in Blender, we are dealing with a Z up axis. That's essentially what you need to know. And like I said before, the Z is hidden unless we're in an orthographic view, which I can show you really quickly. Currently, we're in a perspective group view. If I press 1 on the number pad, you can see I've switched to a front orthographic view. And what this is essentially is I'm looking at the 3D world from what it considers the front perspective. And you can see that that's with Y coming straight at us. In other cases, this may be Z coming straight at us and Y going up. And essentially what happens is this flattens out the view into a 2-dimensional view. We're looking only at the front, and we're omitting the y-axis because it's running directly perpendicularly at us, directly into our face essentially, and it's flattened out so you can't really see it. And so you'll notice that the z-axis does show up in this 2D front orthographic view. And then if I use my middle mouse button to kind of tumble out, we move back to a user perspective view. If I press the 3 button on the keyboard, we have right orthographic, which includes the y and the z axes, but no x-axis because that's the one that's perpendicular to us. If I press the 7 key, we've got the front one, so we have our x and y and no z. And then if I press Control and 1, that inverts it, so we have a back orthographic. Control and 3 will give us a left instead of a right, and Control and 7 gives us a bottom instead of a top. So if for some reason you need to get those specific views and you want them, that's the way to do it. And then the 9 key will actually invert whatever view we're in. So if I press 1 to get front and I hit 9, that'll switch me to back. And so it just gives you an opposite view of whatever view you're looking at. Now the 5 key will switch you between an orthographic and perspective. So if I hit 1, I get a front orthographic. If I hit 5, it's going to switch me to a front perspective. And so you can see with perspective, you have perspective lines that kind of recede into the background. And you actually have a focal view of 50 millimeters here, which is default. It's the closest kind of focal view to the human eye that we have in relation to 3D calculations. And I don't know, you could probably argue that. I'm sure some people will say, oh, it's not really 50, but whatever. If you don't understand what I just said, don't worry about it. It's kind of more in-depth 3D of how kind of 3D programs replicate the way, you know, camera lenses work and the way our eyes work and things like that. So you just need to know the difference between perspective and orthographic, being perspective is actually going to apply more to realistic views, and orthographic is going to apply more to either flattened or isometric kind of two-dimensional views, essentially. That's more or less what we're looking at here. And so I want the front view, so I'm going to hit 1 on the number pad so I can look at this from the front. The even keys, which I kind of glossed over, are just going to nudge you in one direction or another. So if I press the 2 key, it's going to kind of nudge us down. If I press the 8 key, it's going to nudge us up, 6 will nudge us to the right, and 4 will nudge us to the left. So that's really what those even number keys are for. So I'll press 1. Actually, I can kind of tumble out because we need to fix this whole placement location now that I'm done with my view rant. For those of you new users who are not familiar with the 3D system, I'll switch us back into solid mode by pressing Z. And again, there's those options up here. If you don't like using the Z menu, you can find them up here. So we got our wireframe, solid, material, and our render. And so now we need to figure out how we can get this object into the center of our world because it's kind of offset. So we need to keep in mind that there is actually a point here which is denoting the center of the object, which is exactly why Blender brought this in with the Pikachu plushie kind of offset. It's because the origin or the pivot point of the object was offset when Meshroom created it for some reason. And there can be a number of reasons for this that I'm not going to get into because it could be any number of these reasons. It's a really complicated thing. So what you need to know is that every object has a pivot point or an origin point. Those are kind of the two words that you'll see used to describe it. And basically, if we were to do any transformations on this object, and what a transformation is alluding to is either translation or movement. Those two are the same thing, translation or movement, which is essentially sliding or moving around the object. We can rotate it, which is exactly what it sounds like, and then we can scale it, which is kind of like making it larger or smaller, essentially. Any of those transformations, which we might do on this object, are going to be done in relation to this pivot or origin point. So if I want to move it by hitting the G key, you'll see that that point moves and the Pikachu moves in relation to it. I can cancel this transformation by hitting the right click on my mouse or the escape key on my keyboard. Likewise, and this will probably show off the the relation to the origin or pivot point a little bit better, is if I hit the R key for rotation, you'll see that this Pikachu actually rotates around that center point according to my camera view. So I'll cancel that. If I move my camera over here, it's actually going to rotate slightly differently than it was before. It might not look like it, but I promise it is. And the reason for that is because it's going to rotate in relation to this point according to the camera view, the current view that we're in. So for example, if I hit 1 and I hit rotate, it's going to rotate in place because you'll see that our pivot point is centered almost near the center of the Pikachu, and so it's going to rotate. If I hit 3, you'll see that now this pivot point's over here. If I hit R, now it's going to rotate it in relation to it, and you'll see that it's a much larger arc than what we were seeing over here. And like I said, it's because that rotation is occurring according to the view of our camera based on the reference point of that origin or pivot point. Now, if I wanted to constrain that rotation to a specific axis, what I can do is I can press R, and then I can press the key of the axis. And so we have 3 keys to restrain on an axis. We can press the X key, and you'll see that that red axis has lit up. And so now we can only rotate around the red X axis. I'll right click to cancel that. If I press R and then Y, you'll see that the green axis lights up, and now we can only rotate around that axis. Again, I'll right click to cancel that, and then R and then Z, and now we'll only rotate around the Z axis, and you'll see that the Z axis does actually show up when we constrain according to that axis. Again, I'm going to right click and cancel that. The same thing with movement. So movement is G, and I can hit Z, I can hit X, I can hit Y. Alternatively, I can use the middle mouse button, which kind of gives me the ability with this little extra pull to kind of choose which one of these axes I want to move on. So if you really want to do that on the fly, you can do that. I'm just going to right click to cancel that. And then lastly, we have scaling, which is done with the S key. So this is again going according to our camera view. If I press If I press the X key, it's going to scale according to the X, and so it's kind of squishing it. And then eventually what happens is when we approach 0 and we negate the scale, it's actually going to scale through itself and flip. Of course, we never actually want to do that, but I'm just making a note of it. And then if I hit Y, you can see it squishes according to the Y, and then Z, it squishes according to the Z. I'm just going to right-click to cancel that. Those are all the transformations we can do inside of what's known as object mode. And we can check our mode in the upper left-hand corner. And then if I drag this out, we can see that we have edit mode, sculpt mode, a whole bunch of other modes. We're only going to be looking at object and edit mode. So that's all you need to know. Those transformations, if you for whatever reason don't like using hotkeys, which I know a lot of people are not accustomed to, I promise you that if you get used to them inside of Blender, they will become second nature to you. However, if you don't like those hotkeys, there are a number of transformation options over here, specifically those 3, because you can really only do those 3. You have movement, so if I click that, we get a little gizmo that allows us to move. And again, it works in the same fashion. The nice thing about this is it has some intermediate ones, so you can lock on 2 axes. The way that you would do that is you would activate this, and then you'd hit shift in whatever axis you don't want it to move on using the hotkeys. Again, that becomes second nature. I don't really move on 2 axes, but this can sometimes be useful depending on what you're doing. It's up to you. So with movement, we have the ability to constrain by 2 axes. And then, of course, we have rotation, which again is going to rotate us around our various axes. And then if we click in the middle, it'll kind of go according to your 3D view. If you want to do that according to the hotkeys, you simply press R and then press R again. It does the same thing. And then, of course, we have scaling, which is going to allow us to scale according to these axes. Again, as long as you're clicking and holding this and you press right-click, or if you press escape, it's going to cancel that movement. And then if for some reason you want all of those transformation options, you have this last one over here that gives you a gizmo that contains all of these options here. So you have a lot of control around your object. I personally am going to leave it on the select options. I'm going to select my select lasso because that's what I'm going to be working with here in a moment, instead of the box select. So let's just click and hold on this option and hit select lasso. And so now we've worked through transforming our object. Well, we want to transform this object so that it's in the center here. But first we need to get this pivot to center itself upon the object. Otherwise, we're going to keep moving in relation to this pivot. So the way that we do that is making sure that the object is selected, and we can either select it in the 3D window or in the outliner. It doesn't really matter. But make sure that our cursor is in the 3D window when we ultimately go to move the pivot or origin point. And the reason I'm saying pivot or origin is because here it's called set origin, and I did that by right-clicking with the mouse. But here it's called transform pivot. So it would be helpful if Blender would be a little more consistent about its naming conventions about certain things. Here it's called origin, so you can see individual origin is one of the settings. By default, this is set to median point, which if there was more than one object, it's going to average the difference between the 2 origins or the 2 pivots of the object, and it's going to go according to the middle of that, so it's going to average it. So here what we want to do is selecting our object, however we choose to do that, make sure that this is selected, and I'm just going to right-click and say Set Origin, Origin to Geometry, and you'll see now that that orange little dot has jumped from the center of the world over to the center of the mass of our Pikachu. And if you have a mesh that has like an appendage that kind of goes off, it's asymmetrical, and it will try to jump this to the average center of all of the vertices, I believe. Like it'll basically approximate its center distance there. So this might not be completely centered if you have an asymmetrical model. Just keep that in mind. And there are a couple ways to work around that. I'll show you in a minute. But essentially, we just want to get this moved closest to the center of this object. Now that I've done that, we need to get this in the center, and we could try to move it and eyeball it, but the easiest way to do this to be very accurate is, now that we've got this moved, I'm going to press the N key, I'm going to go to item, and I'm going to look for location here, and this is just a side panel that lets us get a little more control over our object, and I'm just going to click and drag down these 3 options. Really quickly there, you saw me dragging there, but I'll click and drag down these 3 options, which will allow me to input the value of 0 and press enter, and you'll see that my Pikachu now jumps to the center of the world, which is at coordinate x0, y0, and z0. So those are those axes values that I was talking about before. Now, before I try to rotate this or scale this Pikachu into the correct orientation, since it's flipped upside down and backwards, I need to do something called applying my transformations. And you'll see here that I have a rotation of 90 and a Y rotation of -0, which honestly I don't think that means anything, but it may cause problems. So we need to apply this rotation value. Otherwise, if I try to scale this or something, it's going to give me problems. So for example, if I try to scale this in the Z, you'll see, whoa, hold on. It's not actually scaling according to that up and down Z value. I'm just going to hit Control Z to undo that because I want to have uniform scaling. But the reason for this is because we have some rotation that has not been applied to the object. So what I'm going to do here is hit Control A, and I'm going to say, which opens up the apply menu, and I'm going to say apply my rotation and scale. You'll see that these numbers zero out. My scale is set back to 1, which it was already at, but just in case it wasn't there, then it'll set it there. And so now if I scale on the Z, you'll see it actually is scaling in accordance to what I would expect. And so I'll just leave that at 1. So now I need to get this Pikachu flipped upside down and facing me. And so there's a number of ways I could do this. I could rotate this 180 degrees on either the X or Y axes. So if I type in 180 here in the X, you'll see it flips properly upwards. I'll zero that out. I'll type 180 in the Y, and there it flips properly upwards. And then I could also do -1 in the Z, which also flips it. Now I'm not going to do that because sometimes, I'll just hit Control Z to undo that. Sometimes when you scale things in the negative direction, it can kind of flip your object inside out, and that can cause problems that we don't want to have. So I'm going to avoid doing negative scaling. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I've had problems with it in the past. We're just going to avoid it altogether just to keep ourselves out of hot water. I think the most appropriate way to do this is adding 180 degrees to the Y-axis. Alternatively, you could do this by pressing R, Y, typing in 180. So it's cool that you can type in very specific values. So if you want to move things by a specific increment, you can type them in rather than trying to eyeball them. You can also do the same thing right over here. It's a little bit quicker to do it in this menu, so we're going to do it that way. And then of course you can see this value is here, so we need to apply this value. So Control A, apply rotation and scale. So now I'm going to press the 1 key so I can see the front view, and our Pikachu is kind of rotated off of center from us, so I'm going to press R and Z, and I'm just going to kind of rotate this. Now if for some reason you're rotating and it's going too fast and you're like, I don't have enough control of this thing, what we want to do is hold the Shift key, and that'll allow us to rotate at a much smaller increment. I'm going to let go of Shift here and just get Pikachu's nose kind of centered on that Z axis. I'll hit Control A and apply my rotation once more. And now you can see my location rotation is zeroed out and my scale is set at a nice uniform 1, 1, 1. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to move Pikachu up. You can do that with the gizmo here. Or you can press G then Z to constrain on the Z axis, which is kind of the way I prefer doing things. And I'll just kind of get it moved so that the floor is kind of lined up with the the horizontal axis, or the x-axis in this case. And again, I'm going to hit apply, but this time I'm going to do location, since location is the one that has value. And I'm just going to say apply location, and you'll see that my pivot has dropped to the bottom there from up here. So before, our origin and pivot, which is the place that we're is the relative point around which we're going to do our transformations, is going to drop down, and you'll notice that the gizmo will drop down with it. So when I apply this, boom, it drops down back to the origin of the world. So that location is in relation to the origin when this is zeroed out. That's where that point is going to be. So that's what you need to know. And when it was up a little bit, it was raised up in the Z-axis by 0.368, yada, 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 up to this point. So we want it to be 0, so we're just going to redo that, which is Control-Shift-Z, which is similar to Photoshop. In other applications, it might be Control-Y. Here, it's Control-Shift-Z. So Control-Z to undo, Control-Shift-Z to redo. And now we have all our values nice and cleanly taken care of and zeroed out for us. So now what I can do is I can go through the process of cleaning up this mesh before we start to remesh it and then eventually reproject our textures onto the new mesh. And so what I want to do is I want to go into my wireframe mode. So I'm going to hit Z and go to wireframe mode. I'm going to hit 1 to go into the front view. And then I'm going to switch over to edit mode. And the way that I choose to do this is I hit the tab key. For you, it might be easier to come up to this menu so you're aware of which view mode you're in. So it's easy to lose track. If you keep switching between the two, you might not be sure which one you're looking at. So just make sure you take a look up here and you'll definitely know which one I'm in. And I just need to, again, come over here and select my select lasso because that's what I'm going to be working with, and then I'm going to hit tab to make sure I'm in edit mode. And then what I want to do is I want to make sure I have nothing selected, so I can either drag my mouse over here, and for some reason it changed my lasso again, so I'll just change that back. So we can select over here, or alternatively we can say select none, which is Alt A. It's completely up to you. Now the reason I had us go into wireframe mode before I entered this view was because I can see through the model. So if I switch this to solid, I can no longer see through the model. I can only see the front side. And so if I try to select a big selection here, you'll see I didn't get all of those points. In fact, some of them were even obscured from the front view that I didn't get those. And I certainly didn't select through the model. Now if I switch this back to the front view and I switch to a wireframe mode and I draw that selection again, you'll see now I've gotten everything that was in the view because I can see through my 3D model, which is exactly what I want. Now, depending on what it is you want to select, this is going to change, of course. So just keep in mind that if you only want to select the front faces, use solid mode. If you want to select all of the components through the model, use wireframe mode. That's really all there is to it. So I'm going to press 1 again, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start selecting some of this loose geometry that I don't need. Now, prior to recording this video, I have taken a little bit of time to get familiar with my model, so I kind of have an idea in the back of my mind what points I want to delete. You might need to switch back and forth between your material preview and object mode in order to kind of see, all right, well, I don't want all this gray stuff here, so this is all the points that I can delete. I obviously don't want all this floating stuff, and I don't really want the floor or this little black prop that was used to hold up the plushie, so maybe I need to go in and clean out some of that stuff. Okay, so take a little bit of time to kind of move around and observe your object and draw some mental notes, or maybe write down on a piece of paper exactly what sort of stuff you want to remove and where that might be located. And then of course take a little bit of time to kind of switch between the different view settings to make sure that you're not accidentally deleting more than what you need. Now we can kind of be liberal with this process because we're going to remesh it, and that remesh is going to close up the holes of the model and it's going to make it watertight, so that if we wanted to 3D print this thing, or if we need to have a solid mesh, it's going to create that for us. It will also delete any of the floating geometry that we don't want associated with this mesh either. So we don't have to be super strict and rigid about how we process this mesh, but just keep a kind of loose mental image about what it is that you're trying to accomplish with this in the back of your mind. So again, I'm going to press the 1 key, I'm going to switch to my wireframe mode, and I'm going to hit tab to go into edit mode. And real quickly, just to get all this extra stuff out of the way, I'm going to press the T key, which closes this side menu, and I'm going to press the N key, which closes this side menu. If for any reason you need to access those again, simply press the T and N keys. Excuse me, I need to take a sip of water. All right, with that out of the way, let's start processing our mesh. So I know I want to get rid of this over here. And again, I don't really have to delete this. The remesher will take care of it, but I'm a little OCD, so I'm just going to do it anyways. And I happen to know that I can get rid of a good amount of this stuff in here. And right now what I'm doing is I'm holding down the shift key to add to the selection. If I wanted to remove something from the selection, say I accidentally selected too much, I don't want all of that, I can hold the control key and I can drag around what I want to remove from the selection. So just keep that in mind. Shift will allow you to add to your selection, and then if I try to make another selection without holding shift, it's going to overwrite it. So you can press Control Z to undo that, of course, if you want, which is very nice. But in this case, we want to be holding the shift key, and then for things that we want to get rid of, hold down the control key. So here I'm just going to draw a kind of rough selection around some of this stuff up here, because I know this is what I want to get rid of. And you may need to take smaller swaths with, the shift key. That's perfectly fine. And just kind of work through some of the stuff that you want to get rid of here. I know that there's quite a bit of this ear that has some of that extra, weird textured stuff on it that I want to get rid of. There's a little thing hanging off the arm here that I want to get rid of. Maybe a little bit of jagged doodad here that I can get rid of. And then here we want to get rid of the floor. So we don't need this floor. And here I can get rid of this stuff. Here I can get rid of this. And I think that's a good starting area. So I'm just going to hit the X key and I'm going to say delete vertices. Again, alternatively, I'll just undo that. You can hit the delete key, which will give you the same menu since we're in edit mode, which is a different mode. But you're still going to have to tell it, well, do you want to delete vertices, edges, faces, etc.? Here we're just going to delete vertices because we're in vertex mode, which is default. And so we have three modes up here. We have vertex, we have edge, and we have face, polygon, whatever you want to call it. And again, those are those three different types of components. So if I kind of zoom in here, and we'll look at this little doodad, and if I select this and press the period key, it'll zoom me in at it, which is a nice way to keep track of your objects. So if you want to zoom in on something, make sure you have it selected and press the period key. Otherwise, press Shift C, which again resets the 3D cursor. It's already in place, so it's not going to move. But that will basically frame everything in the scene. So say we had like 60 different objects, it'll frame everything. And then if we want something specific, press the period key on the number pad. This only works inside the 3D window, so if you're over here and you try to press period, it's not going to work. So just keep that in mind. This is a really useful function. I can't remember if I mentioned this. I've re-recorded this video so many times. But essentially, this is a really nice thing to use. Like say we're in object mode, which I've just switched out into. And let's say that you have a whole bunch of objects. I'm just going to create a cube for the sake of demonstration. I'm going to duplicate it a bunch just so that you can kind of see. I'll move one all the way over here. If you have this and it's off screen and you don't know where it is, well, you can find it in your outliner, and then you can move your mouse cursor into the 3D window and press the period key, and you'll snap right back over to it. If you want to see all of the objects in the window and say none of them are on the screen, simply press Shift C and you'll get all of them, which is a really nice thing to note. And then what I'll do here is I'll just select all of these. I can shift select them all and just press the X key and delete them. So here we'll again press the period key. I'll go back into edit mode, switch over to wireframe, press the 1 key for front view if I want to work in front. And then this same thing works with selection. So if I want to zoom in on that selection back there and that's off screen, then again, press the period key, it'll zoom right in. I can delete that stuff. All right, so hopefully that's helpful. So now let's see, let's take a look at my material preview just to get an idea. I can clean up a little more of that ear. So let's switch back to wireframe. Let's clean this up. We don't need all that stuff. And of course we don't need all this on the floor here. This is kind of a mess. So let's just get rid of some of this. XV, so I've memorized some of these hotkeys. Eventually, if you work with this enough, you'll get the same thing. And I want to get rid of some of this down here. Yep. And then I happen to know that this thing right here, and I've made a mess of that selection, unfortunately, just to try to show you that thing. But this thing right here is actually a little piece of a coffee cup lid that was used to prop this little plushie up, and I want to get rid of that. So I'm going to select that. And I'll use Control Select to just get rid of the parts of the model that I don't want to select. And now I can kind of delete those. So if I go back into my material preview, you can see that there's no more coffee lid there, although there is still some weird object here. So again, I'm going to go into wireframe and I'm just going to select this and delete that. So you're going to need to move around your camera quite a bit, and I'm going to leave some of these floaters here just to show you that the remesh modifier that we're going to use is actually going to clean up a lot of this floating stuff that we don't need to worry about. And here's another part of the floor that I want to delete on this side of the model. So if you're getting kind of confused, it may be necessary to switch into solid mode or even view mode and go out to object mode. And again, just use the hotkeys for that or whatever you're comfortable with, maybe this here, just so that you can kind of get your bearings about you in regards to what you're looking at. Because sometimes when you're in the wireframe mode, it's easy to get disoriented about what's behind the model and what's in front. So make sure you're switching your modes and kind of moving around your object in a sensible fashion. Again, this is something that you kind of get the hang of once you've worked in 3D enough, and it becomes a little bit easier to do without kind of floundering around too much. But for those of you who are brand new to this, I don't expect you to have your bearings about you in 3D 100%. For those of you who do, fantastic, that's great. But for those of you who don't sweat it. Just, be patient with it and stick with it. And before you know it, you'll be on your way to being a 3D master in no time. So now that I've cleaned up this mesh, I want to go into sculpt mode and kind of smooth out some of the really prickly and kind of jagged areas on the mesh to kind of help us along in the next part of the process. So What I'm going to do is I'm back out in object mode and I have the object selected. I'm going to go up to the sculpting tab and I'm going to click on that and I'm going to zoom in. Now here in sculpting mode, we have some tools that kind of allow us to manipulate the mesh in a different way. So before we were kind of transforming things, which is translation, rotation, and scaling. And arguably these same sculpting tools are basically going to do the same thing, but they're going to do them in different ways. And this is closer to sculpting an object with digital clay as opposed to kind of moving and pushing around points in a transformative manner. So this is more like using digital clay. And so essentially what we have here is, if we take a look at the tool panel in the properties menu, what we have is some brush options and some texture options and all this other stuff here that basically control the way that these brushes on the left side panel here work. And so currently we have the draw brush, which is kind of like the standard. It's just like a standard brush that kind of inflates a line that it drags across the model. And really what we're looking for is the smooth brush, which it is actually here, but what you should note is that we can actually engage the smooth brush by holding down the shift key. But before we do any of this, if you pay really close attention, it's kind of hard to see. There's actually this little blue dot that's kind of mirroring the brush location, and what that is by default Blender has X symmetry turned on, and we can either set that off by coming up here, and if you hover over it, it'll say mirror brush across the x-axis. We can turn that off. Alternatively, there's this little twirl down menu here, and this is on by default, so you'll see that this will turn back on. They're basically the same option, just in two different places for you. I'm going to turn that off, and now you'll notice that little blue dot is only in the center of my brush and not mirroring across the model. Now this Pikachu may look symmetrical, but it's actually not, because the way that Meshroom has meshed it, it's got individual points for every part of the model. It hasn't actually mirrored and flipped this thing at all. So it's not symmetrical, and therefore I would like to have more control over what it is that I'm sculpting on. And so I'm going to turn brush symmetry off so I can have control over what I'm doing. Now the goal of what we're doing here, like I said, is we're going to smooth the model out. We're going to look at any jagged peaks or any nasty parts of this model, and we're going to smooth them down with the specific idea that we want to have a smooth contiguous surface, because when we go to reproject the texture from this original model onto the new remesh model, if we have any jagged pieces that are penetrating through the new model, it's going to give us problems. And so we need to address those problems here to start. And so we can actually change the size of our brush and the strength of our brush. We can do that over here. We have a radius option and a strength option. Personally, I like to do it in the main window, and the way that we do that is using the F key. If we press F, it'll allow us to change the size of our brush. So I want a reasonably sized brush. And then if we hit Shift F, it'll allow us to change the strength. I'm going to leave the strength at default, so I'm going to right click to cancel this. And you'll notice we had a little bell curve inside of that. That's called the fall off. And you can see that over here. We had a smooth fall off. There are a couple of other options here. You can define a custom fall off if you want. That's basically just going to change the extents to which this brush is working. I'm going to leave it at smooth as the default, just to keep things simple. If you want to get courageous and experiment with some of those settings, feel free to do so on your own time. So I can see that I've got some funky geometry going here, so I'm just going to hold down the shift key and I'm just going to lightly smooth that out. Now if you find that this is doing too much, you can of course change the brush intensity. The lower we go, you'll see it turns a little bit less dark, and then the higher we go towards 1, it turns more dark. 1 is going to be the most strength, and then closer to 0 is going to be less strength, and I can kind of reduce the amount the brush works, although I'm not sure if that's variable based on the smoothing brush. So if you want the smooth brush in particular, we kind of have to search through here, and here it is, the smooth brush. We can click that, and then here now we can set the strength to be however we want. So by default it's 0.7. Here now it's a little bit less, and then I can change it all the way down, and now you can see it's not smoothing as much. So I kind of like it to be closer to maybe around 0.3 or 4. That seems to be pretty good, because we're not looking to really change the silhouette. We just want to get rid of some of this extra bumpy jagged detail here. And so I'm actually going to undo some of this. I'm just going to look to get some of this really jagged stuff, because ultimately we're going to come back and we're going to apply a smooth modifier to this, and so we don't want to over smooth it, because then we might end up losing some detail in our silhouette. So here's some bumpy stuff here that I want to get rid of, and here So we'll just kind of go over that lightly. There's quite a bit of bumpy stuff in the hand here, so I'm just going to start to solve that problem there. Be careful around these holes that are in the mesh. Like I said, when we remesh this, it's going to close up the holes. And we don't want to smooth too much around them because you'll see they'll kind of expand out. So I'm just going to undo that. We don't really want to open up the holes too wide. We want to have that in the place where it's currently at. We want to work with as much data as we have. And so now I'm just going to go around the mesh and look for really jagged spots that are kind of protruding out and just kind of soften those up. Make sure that there's no overlapping or interpenetrating geometry because, like I said, that'll give us problems later on. So I know these ears are kind of a mess, so let's kind of fix these up a little bit. I'm just going to take a light pass over this. I know I'm hitting some of this edge a little bit. It's not that big a deal. Just try not to do too much. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the underside of the ear. You can see it's really softening it out. However, we're going to run into a problem with the tip of this ear here, and you're going to see we're losing a little bit too much mass. Fortunately for us, there is what's called the inflate brush right here. You can also press the I key on the keyboard. And now I can come back and I can kind of inflate that out now that I've kind of solved some of the smoothing issues that it was having before. And so it's not as jagged as it was before, but now it's, you know, it is smoother and we can inflate it a little bit. We don't want to do too much though. Yeah, I'm going to undo that a little bit. Some of these settings, the brush settings, can be a little bit finicky because the geometry is not what we would call regular geometry. It's very tessellated and decimated geometry. And so it's made up of all these irregular triangles that have different poles in different areas. Now, and if you don't really understand what that means, that's okay. That's just 3D jargon of talking about the way that these edges and vertices converge and form the surface of the object. So now we have this kind of weird area here, and no matter how much I kind of inflate and smooth that, I've got a problem. So the way to solve this, when you see these little weird things that poke into the model, is actually go inside the model, and you might notice that we've got a weird point here. So now if I hold shift and I smooth that out, you can see it's actually going to fix that problem from the inside. So sometimes going on the inside of the model can actually help you fix some of those troubled areas there, and now you can see that it's really kind of smoothed out the surface from the other side. So just keep that in mind. That'll hopefully help you out. There's a little bit of jagged stuff up here. Again, there's some stuff going on the inside, so now I can come in here and I can kind of smooth this out from the other side, and it just takes a little bit of finesse and a little bit of working with it in order to really kind of coax some of these points into the correct spots. And I think that's relatively okay for that ear. Maybe inflate this just a little bit. Let's take a look at the back side. We've got some smoothing issues here. So this area I really want to sort out. Let's kind of get rid of some of this jagged, pokey stuff here and fix some of this over here as well. Okay, so that's looking much better. Maybe smooth this out a little bit. Just make sure that there's nothing that's really crossing over on itself. We want to solve some of those problems. And in here, we want to smooth this out a little bit. Same here. And the feet are going to present us with some unique problems, but we'll get there when we get there. I want to deal with this other ear first. So you can see there's some jagged stuff here that needs to be smoothed out. So I'm just going to move my camera around and smooth that out from this side. This sort of thing works really well with a drawing tablet. So if you've got a Wacom or Wacom, however you want to pronounce that, if you got one of those sorts of tablets, this actually works really well with it. So just kind of be patient and move your way around it. Look at it from all sorts of different angles and try to smooth out some of this less pleasing geometry. Smooth out some of the stuff on the top of the head. Just don't, like I said, don't go too crazy with it. And there we go. That should help us out. And then over here, as well as the underside there, and then over here. All right, so now let's address the feet. We're going to have some problems with the feet. So I think this right foot of Pikachu is going to be okay. And I'm saying right foot even though it's on our left because it's his right foot. So if anyone's familiar with anatomy, that's basically how it's done. Think of it as looking at it from your perspective. A little bit of trivia there. And I'm just going to smooth out this stuff here. And then here is the foot that's going to give us problems because I've done this before. And so I'm just going to kind of just gloss over this very gently, maybe push some of these points back, because I know that this is a problem. If I inflate this too much, you can see that those edges try to converge on each other, which we don't want edges that are kind of pushing into each other. And then here's where the real problem happens, and it's because the geometry of the foot is kind of oriented in a weird way. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use the grab brush, And I can engage that using the G key, which is down here, this grab brush, and I'll make it a slightly bigger one. And I'm just gonna grab some of these points underneath. This may be a little difficult to see, and I'm just gonna pull them down, maybe soften them out. And then if they're really giving me problems, I can actually go back and delete some of them. And yeah, so this is smooth it, grab it, hold down shift to smooth it again. And that's looking a little bit better. It's still kind of a mess. And again, this doesn't have to be perfect. Let's undo that a little bit. This doesn't have to be perfect because the remeshing modifier that we put on this will hopefully help out. I can smooth some of this here, and there's some jagged stuff there. So let's try to form this at least a little bit into some sort of coherent foot-looking shape. And I can smooth around the outside. That's looking a little bit better. It's not perfect, but you know what? That remeshing modifier that we're going to use in a little bit will hopefully solve that problem for us. So now that I've finished kind of sculpting out all those problems, I'm going to go back into the layout menu. I'm going to preview this in material preview. Give it a second to load up that texture again, and that's not too bad. I know there's some big glaring holes in the top of this mesh, but surprisingly, the remesh modifier is going to do a pretty good job at fixing some of those holes. And then in order to recreate the texture, we can actually texture paint in some of those areas back onto the model based on the surrounding colors that exist on that Pikachu already. And if you don't know what that means, don't worry. I'm going to show you what that means when we get there. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to rename this mesh. So I'm just going to double click this here in the outliner. I'm going to call this original. And there we go. It's got a name now. And now what we need to do is duplicate this and create the remesh mesh. So I'm just going to hit Shift D, which is the duplicate option inside of Blender, which creates a second Pikachu, which is going to be moved around. We don't want to move it around, so either hit Escape or the right click on the mouse, and now you'll notice that we have two Pikachus that are laid over on top of each other in the exact same position. And we know this because if we look in the outliner, we have original and original 001. I'm going to rename this original 001 to bake, and the reason I'm calling this bake is because when we project the texture image data from the original model, it's done through a process known as baking. So we're going to bake that texture onto the new model. And so that's what we want to do. Now, before I do anything to this model, I want to unlink the textures that are associated with it off of it because they're sharing the same texture. So the original model has the same material settings and textures as the duplicate, so they're referencing the same data. And we don't want to manipulate that data in any way because we want to preserve it so that way we can project it onto the new mesh that we just created. So with the bake model selected, make sure that we come down here to our material properties, and here we have all 6 of these materials, and I'm going to select the first one and press the minus key, and you'll notice that that kind of breaks the way that this Pikachu looks. If I turn off originally, we'll be able to see it as clearly as possible. And then if I do this again, it'll break even more, and I'm just going to keep doing this until there is no more texture associated with this Pikachu model. Now again, if you imported your model without those texture images in that folder, this is probably what your model is going to look like. So again, make sure you have those image files inside of there, but by the time you've reached this, you most likely have already done that. Alright, so this is what a 3D model looks like inside of Blender when it doesn't have any materials associated with it. So we need to create a new material for this model, and we do this simply by clicking this new material, and essentially nothing's changed because it's default, and we have material 001. I'm just going to rename this to bake so I know which material I'm looking at. And then of course we also don't need any complicated material settings, which by default Blender generates a principled BSDF, which is just a way of showing that there are various sets of mathematics that are dictating the surface quality of this material. We don't need all of that complication, so I'm going to change the surface from principled BSDF to diffuse BSDF. And essentially all that means is that we're looking at the color that is applied to the surface of the model, and then there's a roughness value that changes some of the way that that color is determined. I'm just going to slide this down to 0. We don't need to worry about roughness, and we don't need to worry about normal. We're not going to deal with those. We're literally just concerning ourselves with the color of this model. So Right now the color is set to white. If I click this, I can set it to any other color, and you'll see it updates inside the viewport because we are in our material preview mode. If I switch this to solid, it's not going to change. So just keep in mind that if you're doing this and it's not changing, it's because you're probably in solid mode. Make sure you're in material preview mode. And so I'm just going to set this to a bright green, or actually, you know, it's a Pikachu. Let's make it yellow. Duh. So I'll make this like a yellow orangish color, just so that we know which one is the bake one and which one is the original one. Or, you know, it might actually be more helpful to make it a different color just so we don't get confused. So I'll make this one red. All right, so there we go. So we have our bake model and we have our original model. Now, make sure that when you edit those materials or you delete those materials, you're doing it on the bake model. If you delete those materials off the original model and you try to bake this onto the bake model, it's not going to work. And you might be sitting there scratching your head going, why didn't it work? And it's because we need to preserve the original textures and materials on the original model. Okay, with that out of the way, let's hide the original, let's turn on the bake. And now what we need to do is we need to simplify this model. So at this point, I would encourage you to save the file. So I'm just going to do that with a quick Control S, and I'm just going to save this onto my desktop. I'm going to call it Pika. Pika.blend. Obviously, put it in a folder, name it after yourself, name it something that it's gonna be helpful to remembering where this is, or just make sure you keep your files organized. For me, putting on the desktop is enough for now. All right, so now I need to simplify this mesh because we still have several hundreds of thousands of vertices. We've reduced it a little bit by deleting some of those points, but we need to make this really simple. We need to reduce the number of points because we don't need that much geometry. We don't need that much texture density. It's fine. So let's reduce this. So the way that we're going to do this is with our bake model selected, we need to find this little wrench here, which is our modifier properties tab, and that will allow us to add modifiers to the surface of our mesh. So if I click add modifier, I can open this up and then I have a number of options available to me. So I can decimate the mesh, which is going to reduce the number of vertices on it. I can remesh the mesh, which is actually what I'm looking for, which is right here. And then we have a smoothing algorithm as well, or smoothing modifier as well, which we will look at most likely after we're done remeshing it. So the first thing I want to do is I want to remesh this mesh. And what this is doing, essentially, I can walk you through this. We have a mode for how it remeshes. So by default, it's set to sharp. We want to set this to smooth, and that'll kind of change the way that it does things. And if I actually go into solid mode, you can kind of see what's actually happening. So toggle this little real-time display modifier here, and you can see the way it's treating the geometry. It's kind of looking at the overall shape of it, and it's recreating that shape. It's closing off the mesh and making it watertight, and it's trying to recreate that shape. Now, currently, we don't have enough detail on this modifier in order to recreate this. And the way we give it more detail is called octree depth. So if I turn this to 5, you can see, we're getting a little more detail. 6, okay, we're getting there. 7, that's pretty close. And in fact, I'm going to stop at 7 because we're getting dense now. If I zoom in here, you can see we got a lot of polygons. If I use wireframe, it's a lot of vertices and polygons. It's nowhere near as many as we had before, hundreds of thousands. We're at about 30,000 right now. But that's still enough. In fact, we're going to go lower than this, but we're going to do that with a decimate modifier later on. Currently, what we're doing right now is we're trying to get a watertight mesh that is solid. That's the most important thing. Now what I want to do is I'm going to apply this. And you'll notice that if I go back to my material preview, we have lost if I had left the materials attached to this, it would have turned black. We would have lost the data, because what's happening is in this original one, if it'll turn on, we have what's called a UV layout. And essentially what that is, it's basically like if you can think of all of those chocolates that you receive around the holidays. So like on Easter, you might get an Easter bunny chocolate that's wrapped in tin foil. And that tin foil perhaps has a design printed on it that gives the illusion of the bunny surface. So maybe it's got a little red nose and some white fur painted onto it or something. And then that's wrapped around the chocolate to give it its texture. That's essentially what's happening here. We have a 2-dimensional texture that's being wrapped and mapped upon our 3-dimensional geometry. And so that's called a UV layout. Now, Meshroom, it creates a UV layout for us. So if I click this original model and I go up here and type in, or click UV editing, you can see here's one of the 6 image textures that are associated with this model. And if I select all these points, you can see all these points are actually laid out on top of that. So it kind of does this in a machined way. It's not really human readable. It just kind of lays them all out. So it's a little bit difficult to make sense of when you're looking at this for the first time. But I promise you, this is basically how it works. It lays out the geometry onto a 2-dimensional image by creating seams and cuts in the model. And it determines where that's going to be mapped across the surface of this model. So if I go back into the layout view, if I were to try to do that with this model, it's kind of obliterated that because remember, we created all new geometry using this modifier. So if I go back to solid mode, you can see this is no longer the solid. This no longer has the same points as this. So currently we don't have a layout that makes sense to what we had before, which is why we need to reproject the old one back onto the new one. All right. So, but we have essentially created a solid 3D model, which is exactly what we were trying to do. So now I can add a smooth modifier. Again, I'm on my bake model. And the smooth modifier, what it does is it kind of looks at the surface and it looks at the highs and lows and it kind of averages between them to try to smooth out the surface of the model. So we have a factor, so it's smoothing by a factor of 50% or 0.5, and it's repeating that one time. Generally, you're going to have to crank this up to about 10, maybe even 20 to really start seeing some of the effects of this modifier. If I toggle this on and off, you can see now it's really affecting this. So I want a really smooth model, not overly smooth. If you've got some really specific surface detail, you wouldn't want to apply this up as high as 20% or 20 times. Maybe you'll only do 5 or 10. It depends on what it is you're trying to accomplish. So for me, having this smooth model is good enough. So I'm just going to press apply here. And so now I have this very smooth Pikachu. Again, I could go back into the sculpting mode and kind of smooth out some of these points here. It's actually created this weird geometry here, so I might actually have to come in through here and delete some of these points just to kind of clear up this weird bridge that it's creating. And that can kind of happen sometimes with the remeshing option, so I'll delete that. And then I'm going to throw another remesh modifier on top of it to close everything up and make sure it's all hunky-dory. So again, I'm going to go smooth, set this up to 7, and maybe even just 6 this time, and that's fine. Apply this. And you'll see now it's kind of fixed that weird setting there. And again, I could go through and smooth this again if I really wanted to, but this should be fine. And so now what I want to do is I'm going to decimate this down. So I'm going to find the decimate modifier. And what that's going to do is it's going to take a ratio of the number of vertices that I have in this, and it's going to reduce this down. And so it's not like a perfect ratio because the number of faces and vertices that it reduces it by is going to be a kind of variable because it needs to preserve the surface of the model. So currently we're at 7,494 vertices, which is a lot, but it's reasonable. And I'm going to type in 0.5 here as the ratio, and you'll see that this is going to drop roughly in half. So that's essentially how that works. Now for me, I happen to know that I like using the planar option and then cranking up the limit on this to try to get this really low. Now you don't want to go so high that it breaks. Obviously we don't want to break it. So we want to have a reasonable level of density so that we can preserve the silhouette. And basically we like see here the silhouette's more or less broken. We don't want to go that high. So we want to preserve the silhouette somewhat, but also have a good enough reduction in polygons. So for me, the angle limit's about 20% on planar. Normally it's set to collapse. I'm going to set it to planar and have about 20%. You can also turn on all boundaries. That may give you some better options. So now we're down at like 513 verts. That may not be what I want it. So I'm going to turn off this all boundaries, and maybe 21% is not quite there. So let's say I want to get this at around 1,000 vertices. You know, that's not bad, all things considered. And the reason I'm doing this is because I want to make sure that I have a reasonable level of detail and a reasonable silhouette. So I think that's a simplified enough silhouette. I'm going to hit apply. And now the last thing that I need to do, if I go into solid mode, you can see it's still kind of jagged. I need to add some triangles into here because some of the polygons that were just created are irregular because they're not being closed off entirely, which is kind of a byproduct of using that planar algorithm inside of the decimate modifier. So what I need to do is I need to add a triangulate modifier, and now you'll see it's a little more regularly tessellated. So I can hit apply, and then there we go. The last thing I need to do is I need to right click and say shade smooth. And so now you can see it's a much more simplified model that still follows the silhouette of the Pikachu plushie, and I will be able to project the texture of that on here. So now there are a couple of things I need to do before we can do the texturing setup for this. So I'm going to right click, or not right click, I'm going to tab into edit mode, and you can see now that our geometry is vastly simplified by comparison to what it was before. We can just take a look at this real quickly, and you can see, you know, that's a lot of points. This one, not so much. It's pretty nice. So now what we're going to do is with this new one, this bake one, I'm going to hide the original. Or actually, I'm going to leave the original one on, just so that we can see them. So you can see they're overlaid, and you can see they're kind of intersecting each other. In the process of baking, what we want, generally speaking, is we want the mesh that's going to accept the new texture to be slightly larger than the original mesh, because it's going to, what Blender's going to do is it's going to kind of cast rays and project through the surface of the original mesh onto the new mesh. And so we need to kind of inflate the mesh just a little bit. Now you might be thinking, oh, we could do that in the sculpt menu. And you're right, you could do it in the sculpt menu, but we want to do it uniformly across the entire model. So what I'm going to do is with the bake model selected, I'm going to hit tab, I'm going to press A to select all of the vertices on the surface of this model, and I'm going to hit Alt and then A, or sorry, not Alt and A, what is it? Alt S, that's what I'm looking for. And so now what this will allow me to do is inflate all of the vertices of the model. Essentially what we're doing is we're moving all of the vertices according to their normals, but that's something that you don't really need to know currently, so just think of it as inflating the model. And so I'm going to hold down the Shift key, I'm going to undo that, I'm going to hit Alt S, hold down the Shift key, and just move my cursor so that way it kind of inflates the model, so that we don't have any more interpenetration happening. So be very careful, because in some places like here near the neck and the arms, we don't want them to interpenetrate on themselves. We just want to inflate out just enough so that way it kind of gets enough of this encompassing the model like that. And so I can see that there's a little interpenetration going on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the tab key, and I'm going to go into sculpting, and I'm just kind of take a smaller brush and kind of smooth some of that out so that it's not penetrating in on itself, but it's also not showing any of the model through. So here we have an example of where I can use the grab or inflate brush and kind of move some of that stuff. Some of this stuff penetrating outwards is fine because we're going to texture paint that anyways, but for the most part, make sure that we're not interpenetrating any major parts of the textured model that we want to keep. And this looks mostly okay to me. I think this should be fine. Let's kind of move some of this up a little bit, and that should be okay. I'm pretty sure that's going to be just fine. All right, so now that we have this simplified model, we need to do one more thing before we try to project, and that's we need to create that UV layout that I was talking about. There is a point up here that I want to relax, so I'm just going to go back into sculpting. I'm going to find that area. You can see it's got a weird shading error going on, and now if I smooth that out, there we go. And then I can hit the I key and kind of just inflate this a little bit here, just to get this over the top. Don't want to go too crazy, so I'll smooth down some of that. And there we go. Now it's encompassing kind of the way we want it to do. That should be good enough. All right, so go back to layout. All right, so now we need to create a UV layout for this new mesh, this new smooth mesh that we've created. And so if I hit tab, and also I hit right click and I shaded this smooth. You have shade flat, which shows the tessellation, and shade smooth. We want to keep it shade smooth because that's going to help us in the baking process, and it's also just going to make it look better. So I'm going to hit tab, I'm going to go into my edit mode, I'm going to select the whole model, and this is going to give some hardcore 3D modelers a little bit of anxiety because typically you're told not to use this kind of unwrapping method, but because if you consider what we've already created inside of Mesh Room, if I hit UV editing, this sort of UV unwrapping here, which is the original model, the original texture that we're seeing here, it's already machined. Basically what this is a product of is it's Mesh Room looking at the surface and saying, all right, I need to rip this thing apart and map all the 2D textures onto the surface of it the best way I can. And so this is not what you would expect to see if you were doing this by hand, but since we already have a machined UV model going on, it's okay to use this process. You wouldn't necessarily use this in a production ready workflow, but again, like I said, for these static meshes, for these low poly meshes that you're trying to kind of optimize based on a photogrammetry output that we're trying to accomplish in one sitting, more or less, it's okay to do it this way. Again, I know it's going to give some hardcore 3D modelers a bit of anxiety, and in a future video, I'll probably go through the quote unquote proper way of doing this. But in the meantime, this will get us where we need to go. So with the whole model selected and I've moved into the UV editing layout, what I can do is I can hit the U key, make sure that we're in the 3D window. I'll hit the U key on the keyboard and simply hit Smart UV Project, and it'll give me some options. I'm going to leave them all default and I'm going to hit OK. And now what that's going to do is it's going to update the left side here, and you can see it's automatically generated us a UV layout that we can use to project the new texture onto. And so we need to do a little bit of setup before we get into the baking. So I'm going to go back to my layout now that we've created that UV layout for our bake mesh. Again, don't do that on the original mesh because it's going to be a lot more complicated. It's going to take a lot longer time, and it's also going to damage your original textures. So make sure that what we just did, you have done on the bake mesh, please. And now we can set up some of our textures and our baking options. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to hit shading, and that's going to switch us to a shading workspace. That may take a second. If I kind of zoom in on this model, again, I can use the period key to do that. You can see I've got the bake model here, and you'll see that we have down here what's called the node editor. We have a viewer over here. We don't need to worry so much about this. In fact, I can collapse this one on the left side. And down here we have an image texture preview along with a node editor. What this node editor is, it's a different way of visualizing what's going on inside of this material panel to the right side. So remember when I switched the surface from principled BSDF to diffuse BSDF? Well, if we have the original, not the original, but the baked model selected, you can see I've got this diffuse BSDF node right here, which corresponds to this diffuse BSDF over here with the same color piped in and the same roughness value piped in. You can see that this corresponds to this over here, and it's being put into the surface quality of our material output. That's basically telling Blender how to render this object in the viewport. And eventually what's going to happen is we're going to create a texture image, and we're going to put it in the place of this color, so the surface will no longer be red, but it'll actually look like the surface of this Pikachu, just projected onto this new geometry that we've created. That's essentially how that works. So what we need to do is we need to create this new image texture for that process. And the way that we do this is we're going to put our mouse inside of the node viewer over here, or the shader network, or whatever this thing is called. It's changed its name so many times. This used to be called the node editor. Now it's called the shader editor, and it works with a series of nodes, which is what we're looking at here. We need to create an image texture node. So making sure that our mouse cursor is inside of this shader editor, we're going to hit Shift A, which will open up an add menu. We're going to hit search, and we're going to type in image. And what that does is it'll give us the filter of image texture, which is exactly what we're looking for. We're going to click and drop that into the window. So now we need to create the slot for the image texture. So we've created the image texture node. Now we need the actual slot for the image to go in this. So if we had an image that existed on the computer, this is actually how we would manually link those textures if we didn't have them in our folder. So if I switch over to the original, you can see that the original had a principled BSDF, which in the new version I changed to a diffuse BSDF. You see this is the original here. And in the first material I have here, I have texture 1001.png. And so if for some reason this was missing this, I would have to add in the image texture, or maybe this would be here, but it would be missing the link. And then I could hit this folder and I could look for the image texture. And there are those 6 image textures that are in that folder that I was telling you about earlier. So if for some reason you're missing that, this is how you would manually relink them. So again, you'd see texture underscore 1001.png, and there would probably be nothing here because it wouldn't know where it is. And then you could click this folder and you could find it and you could link it back to the original one, but you'd have to fish for it around on your computer. Now, you'll notice that this is just for texture 1001. If I click this, you can see it's got a totally different principled BSDF with texture 1002, and then onwards for number 3, 4, and 5. Now they look exactly the same, but I promise you they're different. So if I move this, for example, let's say I move this here, you'll see that 4 is actually different than 5, which is different than 1, for example. So these are all different nodes associated with 6 different materials. I know that may be difficult to wrap your head around at this point if you don't know what you're looking at, but essentially we've got 6 different materials with 6 different texture nodes piped into 6 different principled BSDFs, piped into 6 different material outputs. Now, like I said before, that's a lot. So we want just one texture node piped into one diffuse node, piped into our material output. And so that's what we're aiming to achieve. So we need a new image texture. And the way that we do that is we're not going to open one because it doesn't exist yet. We haven't created it. We're going to hit this new button. And so here I'm going to call this bake. And what I want is I want a width and height of 1024 by 1024. So if you haven't caught on yet, almost all 3D image textures are naturally going to work by a power of 2. So 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1024, which is what we're looking at, 2048, which is also really common, 4096, which is gaining more popularity but is still on the large side, and then we get all the way up to 8K, which is kind of the upper limit of what we're really seeing, although I'm sure there are some people out there who are perhaps experimenting with larger sizes. Excuse me. For our purposes, we don't really have to go that big. So we're going to stick with 1024. You may be able to get away with 512. If you really need higher texture resolution, then go with 2048. But we're going to stick with 1024. We're also going to turn off this alpha option. Essentially what that is it adds an extra channel with more data to consider transparency. If you're familiar with Photoshop, that also has a channels option in it for R, G, and B, red, green, and blue. Those are black and white values that determine the amount of red, green, and blue that is going to be shown in the color layers of that Photoshop file. You'll note that if you add another channel in Photoshop, it'll actually come in as an alpha channel. And so again, it's a black and white value that determines how transparent the pixels are going to be for that specific channel. We don't need any transparency in this image texture, so we're going to turn that off. Now there are other options down here. We're not going to concern ourselves with those. We can leave them by default, but again, turn that alpha off and hit OK. And so now what's happened is we have created a blank image texture called bake, and so I can show you what that looks like over here. If I switch this to a UV editor, and then I switch this over here to that bake, you see, boom, we have an image that's 1024 pixels by 1024, and it's completely black because we just created it. There's literally nothing there to see. And so now we need to take all of the material and image texture data from the original and put it into this new 1024 by 1024 texture that we just created. And so the way that we do this is we're going to go into our outliner here, and we're going to select the original, and then we're going to shift select the bake one. In fact, I think it might be backwards. So the way that we want to do this in the window, if we can find it, if they're not overlapping. For those of you in 2.80, it's going to be backwards to this. I think there's a weird bug going on in 2.81 where they've kind of flipped it. But essentially, we want to make sure that in the 3D window, we select the original one. You can see I just did that there. And then we're going to shift select the new one. So this is what it should look like in the 3D window. So before, when I click this and I shift select this, you can see that this one's bright orange and this one is dark orange. That's not how we want it. We want this one bright orange and then shift select that one dark orange. So in Blender 2.80, if you do it in the outliner the way I just showed you, it should work fine. In 2.81, for some reason, there's some weird bug or they've changed the way that they've done this. But essentially, what we want is we want to select the original one and then make the active one, the last one that we select is typically what's active, the bake one. And the reason why we want to do that is because the way that Blender functions is we're going to bake from the selected to the active. That's essentially how it works. And if that doesn't make sense, the selected one is the dark orange and the active one is the bright orange. So just make sure that you have it set up like this, that the selected is dark orange, so that's original, and the active is bright orange, which is bake. All right, so now what we need to do is make sure that this texture image is selected, so it needs to have a white border over here, and that's going to be in the bake model, which is why it needs to be the active one. And then we need to change some of our render settings in order to allow us to bake this texture. So come down here to our render properties, change our render engine from Eevee, which is the default, to cycles, and you'll notice some of these settings change. Now, cycles enables us to bake textures. So I'm going to change my device to GPU compute because I have CUDA enabled GPUs in this machine. If you don't have a CUDA enabled GPU or even know what I'm talking about, that's fine, just leave it on CPU. If you want to check, you can say edit, preferences, and then we're going to go to system and see I have CUDA here. Yours might be set to none, but here I have CUDA, and I have 2 CUDA enabled graphics cards, which I have enabled, so that enables me to use GPU as the device. If you don't have those, say you have an AMD graphics card or something else in your machine, it's okay, leave it on CPU. It may take slightly longer to compute, but it won't be that much longer. It may take maybe a couple minutes longer. Not a big deal. Maybe only a couple seconds longer, depending on how big. This is not a very big texture, so it shouldn't take that long, I promise you. Not unless you really mess something up. So it should be okay. So I'm going to leave mine on GPU compute. You can leave yours on CPU or follow along with GPU if you've got the GPUs. If you're one of the people who are from the Retner lab, I don't believe any of those machines, unless you're on a Windows machine, has a CUDA enabled GPU. All of the Windows machines should. In fact, they should have better, more updated graphics cards than I have in my machine. But if you're on the Mac side of the lab, try to stick with CPU because I'm pretty sure that's what's going to work best. All right, so now that we have those settings configured, we need to go down to the Bake tab and just open that up. And there are a couple options here. So first of all, we have Bake Type Combined. We want to change this to Diffuse because remember, we're working with a diffuse BSDF, and so we want just a diffuse. Now there are some other settings here. We're going to turn off direct and indirect from the influence, and what that's considering is the scene lighting. We literally only want the color data. So technically in 3D, a diffuse map actually takes into consideration the color data and the lighting or shading of that color data. There's another map type called an albedo map, which literally takes into consideration just the color data without any shading. The shading in that situation with an albedo map is generally dictated by another map called an ambient occlusion map. And that's a black and white map that's usually overlaid over the top of the colored albedo map to give the illusion that there is shading on top of that color. And this is a great way to create a smaller sized color map that can be mapped across the surface of an object, and then using that ambient occlusion map can allow you to change the color variation of your model. So that's kind of some technical 3D texture and material design talk there, but essentially what we want here is we want diffuse and color only. The last thing that we need to set is selected to active, which is again what we were setting up earlier. So we're going to bake our texture data from the selected model, this dark orange, to the active model, which is the bright orange. And the reason we do that again is because the active model is going to show down here in the node view, and we need to have this texture that we created selected. And with all of that set up, and I know it's a lot, feel free to rewind as many times as you need or rewatch it as many times as you want, we can finally hit the bake button at long last. And you'll notice here at the bottom of the shader editor of the node window, it's going to show the percentage of the texture that's been baked, and then soon enough this window on the left side is going to show our new texture. And now the final moment that we want to have here is, let's turn off our original. We can see that our Pikachu is still red even though we have this texture, and we're going to drag this node over here, and we finally have our new textured Pikachu. You can see it still has enough texture density, but it's not crazy, and it's only one material on our model now called Bake, and it's got that Pikachu texture that we just created. So we've got one Pikachu image texture in our one material that's linked to our one mesh, and we can save it now with Control S, and if we want, I can do Control Shift S to save a second model. I'll call this Pika_final perhaps. And now what I can do is I can delete this original model out of here and save it one more time. And now Now I don't have to worry about losing that original model. I can go back to the Pika.blend, and in this final model I can get rid of it and kind of reduce the size of my file. So let's go back to my layout window, and I'm going to go to Material Preview. And if this is all that I want, despite all this ugly stuff on top of here, well, that's all I need. Now I can save this as a .blend file, and I can upload this to Sketchfab, and it'll be fantastic. If I kind of preview this, I can actually check the size of the file, and it should be relatively small. So the Pika_file.blend, if I go here, File, Save As, you can see it's only 1 megabyte. That's tiny. That's so much smaller than the 50 megabyte limitation. And so now this thing will run pretty fast inside a game engine. You can see that we've only got so much geometry here, and yet it still looks like a Pikachu plushie, which is exactly what we were trying to accomplish. Now, let's take it a step further. I'm going to show you how we can texture paint this thing to try to get this top and bottom of the Pikachu looking just a little bit better. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to click the texture paint option here, and what we can do is, let's switch this back to Material Preview because by default it goes into rendering for some reason. We want to click here and drop down to Bake, and there we go. We've got our Pikachu texture here. So the cool thing about this is, let me make sure that I have the right settings. I'm going to sit up because I'm kind of slouching in my chair. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that we're not in object mode. So for some reason, texture paint mode, okay. The reason why it didn't work is because I didn't have the model selected. So let's go back to layout, select the model, and now go into texture paint mode. And there we go. It's already set up with us with our new baked material, and it's given us some brush settings. So now we can finally paint on the surface of our model. Now, if we had to set this all up from scratch, it'd be a pain, but because we baked this texture and we had it selected and we moved over to texture paint mode, it's finally just kind of all set up for us. So that's the nice thing about new versions of Blender. Before you had to set this all up manually. Fortunately, now I can literally just start painting on the surface of Pikachu and making him white if I really wanted to do that. That's not what I'm trying to accomplish, but it's a lot. It's just as someone who's used Blender before and had to set all this stuff up and had such a headache about this. Fortunately, it's already set up for me and I don't have to worry about it. So I'm just very overwhelmingly grateful for that. So again, we have our brush settings similar to sculpt mode. Again, you can change the size of the brush with the F key. Let's make it a little smaller. We can change the influence of the brush with the Shift F, which I'm going to make this about 0.5. So it's about 50%. So you're going to have to click like a couple times to get it to kind of fill in 100% opacity. Again, you can hit Control Z to reduce that or undo that. And what I want to do now is direct your attention over to the color picker. I'm going to click this option here, I'm going to click my color picker, and I'm just going to look for some colors close to the ones that I want to replace this with. So there, and now I can begin to kind of paint in on the top of the surface. Maybe I need a little more influence, so we'll put that at about 0.7. The reason I have it at a low influence is because you're going to want to come through here and you're going to want to kind of pick some colors and kind of layer these colors on top of each other so that way it's somewhat consistent and not super blotchy or super obvious that you're painting this texture on here. And so we can kind of go through and kind of paint over some of this troublesome stuff. Again, this is a much better process to tackle with a Wacom tablet. I have mine to the left of me. I just don't want to plug it in and install the drivers because I've recently had a fresh install on this computer. So I'm just going to kind of tough it out with the mouse here. So I'm going to undo some of this. Now, it's worth noting that sometimes the texture picker can be a little bit finicky because it's expecting to see shading data, and we don't have any lighting here, so we're just going to kind of rough it just by looking at it. And so you may have to select multiple times from different areas on the model to try to get it to do what you want, and that's okay. Just be patient with it and just kind of fill in some of these areas here to fix up the model, make it look a little bit better. And that should be all right. So I'm just going to really quickly go through this. Obviously, with yours, spend a little more time on this. A little time and dedication go a long way. And that's looking pretty good. You can also go in and clean up some of the texture artifacts on the tip of the ear, for example. So we can come in here and grab this, and we can begin to clean up some of this just to make it look a little more uniform, a little more pleasing to the eyes. We're going to art direct this a little bit just to make sure it is what we want it to be. If you need to change the harshness of the brush, consider looking at your fall off. So here we have a smooth fall off. We can do something perhaps as a constant fall off, which is a little more direct. So you can see here, now it's a little more harsh around that edge. Personally, I like doing a custom fall off where it's kind of like this. So it's smooth coming down here, but it's still somewhat of a defined edge, perhaps even back a little bit further. Oops. Like that. There we go. That's about right. So now I can kind of come through and brush this off, brush this up here. So we have a little bit of a harsh transition there. So I can kind of come in here and grab one of these lighter colors and then just kind of go over the top. And maybe this fall off needs to be a little more smooth. So let's bring that back. So there we go. And then again, like I said, try to layer some of these things so that way they're not so obvious, you know? And then you can also do the opacity by backing this off, and you can come through with multiple passes to really soften that so it's not so obvious that you painted this. Like I said, art direct this, kind of be diligent and thoughtful about how you do this. It's not so bad. There we go. So now I can kind of soften up the transition from the light parts of Pikachu's head there and kind of fake the way that it looks a little bit. Maybe go through the back of the hands, etc. So I think this is good enough for a stopping point for the manipulation on this. Obviously with yours, go through and be really diligent, address the bottom of the model, like really try to get this looking somewhat good, you know, somewhat presentable, because that's the whole goal of this, is we want something that we can present and put in our portfolio and show off, hey, you know, I know how to optimize geometry, I know how to paint textures. You know, these are all valuable skills that if you can demonstrate that you know how to do these well, you could land a job or you know, get further into 3D, and who knows, maybe you'll be a 3D art director one day. Always valuable to have these sorts of skill sets. So basically what I've shown you at this point is we've taken a very complicated photogrammetry mesh and we've simplified it down to a decimated mesh that again is not really useful for animation, but this could be something that you could stick into a game engine, and maybe this is some sort of collectible item that the character can, or the player can pick up and move around in front of their face, and you know, it's part of an engaging experience. It would run well in a game engine, and we're of course going to upload this online onto Sketchfab. So I'm just going to go File and Save. Now what we want to do here is actually, before I try to upload this, I want to teach you how to pack a file into Blender. So the first thing I need to do is make sure I get rid of my orphan data. And orphan data is basically images that are left over that I do not need anymore. So if I come over here to the outliner and just look for orphan data up here, you can see that, well, there should be images associated with the textured mesh, and now there are. Okay, so originally we had the textured mesh that had all of these materials, and those materials had associated images with them. Well, currently there are 0 textured meshes in here and 0 cubes and all this other stuff. The only meshes that we want to keep are the new mesh, and it's not listed in orphan data because it's currently being used in this scene here under my objects in the bake here. So what we want to do is, again, go into orphan data and hit the purge button, and it's going to say purge unused data blocks, 1 material, 7 meshes, 1 light, and 1 camera, which are all the objects I created and deleted. We can purge those, and now you'll see that we don't have, or we shouldn't have, I can delete these as well. It should have deleted these out of here, but for some reason it didn't. Essentially, we want to get rid of basically all these textures. And so that should be okay. I'm pretty sure it should have gotten rid of them. And so now when we go to save this, I can go File, External Data, Pack All into .blend. Some images are painted on. These changes will be lost, continue. Okay, so what that means is when we created that new texture, we need to save it. And the way that we can tell that is if I go into texture paint or UV editing, either one should work. You can see here this image has an asterisk. So this is something I forgot to mention that's actually really important, so I'm kind of kicking myself about it. But hopefully you've stuck with me long enough to get to this point, I hope. And so what this means is this asterisk here means we need to save this image. So we need to save it and we need to put it someplace. So I saved my file onto the desktop, obviously saved this into a folder folder to contain your project. And what we need to do is we need to save that texture image file that we created in the baking process and then that we edited in the painting process so that Blender has a reference to it. Ultimately, we're going to pack this into the Blender file, but first we need to save this file. It has to exist somewhere on the computer in order for Blender to pack it into the file. So what we need to do is, I'm going to change my compression of the PNG down to 0 so it's lossless. If you want to compress it to save even more space, you're welcome to do so. I don't like to do that because it will reduce some of the quality. It's not that big of a deal if you forget to reduce the compression to 0%, but I prefer to do it. And then I'm just going to save this onto the desktop, save as image, and now you'll see we have no more asterisks. So if I go back to layout, if I say file, save, it'll save, and if I say file, external data, pack into dot blend, it'll say packed 7 files. So unfortunately, it packed those other image texture files because Blender's a bit finicky with this. We can get rid of those, and I'll show you how to do that in a moment. But it's also packed that texture file that we created and that we painted on. So if I go to image UV editing and I go over to this image texture 1001, I can say image and then I can say unpack, and it'll say, are you sure you want to unpack it? And I'll say yes, I want to remove it. And then I'll do the same thing in number 2 and I'll say image, unpack, and do this. And so unfortunately, because Blender is finicky and I'm not entirely certain how to get this to do it, it's something that I gotta play around with a little bit more. I'm just gonna manually unpack these. It's a bit of tedium, but you know what? It's fine. We don't really have to do this because the file size is so tiny anyways, but I really want to make sure that I'm getting this right, and so I'm just gonna unpack these image textures. Obviously, do not unpack the bake option here. Just unpack the errant image textures. And now if we save this, we can say file save, and then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to close out of this, and it's going to show me my desktop, and I'm going to go back into Blender, which is, I'm using the Steam version. So let's just open that up really quickly, and we'll open that file up again. So this is kind of the way you had to do it before, is like you would close up the file and it would automatically delete the orphan data for you, and that was kind of the way that you were preferred doing it. So let's take a look at it, and for some reason it's still showing these here. I'm not sure why, and it still has them here. I unpack these and yet it's still okay. So it's looking at the external link for these. Let's see if I purge this, if it does it. Yep. Can I? Okay, so we still have our texture, which is good. Can I unlink and delete? Ah, there we go. So for some reason it doesn't have a delete button. That's incredibly annoying. I wish they would add in a solution for that. So there we go. I've deleted all of those, which is exactly what we want to get rid of. So we've purged all of that. So now finally, at long last, I can save this again, and I can go file, external data, pack all into .blend, and it's packed 2 files. And I can go file and save. And there, hopefully, we should finally have no more orphan data, which is true, we don't. We just have brushes. And we have our tiny Blender file. So if I go in here one more time and say file save as, you can see we're down to, I don't know why this got larger, 13 megabytes. Either way, it's still tiny. It's still what we need it to be, and it'll work perfect for what we're going for. So, because we packed the image file, that's right. So previously it was tiny, it was 1 megabyte, and that was prior to having packed the image texture. Now that we packed the image texture into it, it's a little bit larger, but it's still under 20 megs, which is well underneath our 50 meg limitation. So earlier when I was all huzzahing over the fact that it was so tiny and I was so surprised by that, it was because I hadn't yet packed the images into the Blender file. So if I actually go back and open up the other one, we'll save this. If I go back and open the original Pika.blend and I try to pack the image textures into this, we can actually see what it would have actually have been. So here I'm just going to go file, I'm going to save this, and then I'm going to go file, external data, pack all into .blend, and you'll see it pack those 6 files. I'm going to save this one more time, and then I'm going to go back and I'm going to open up the previous one, and I'm going to see exactly how large. Okay, so here we have a better representation. So with those 6 4K image textures packed into that Blender file, it would have been 74.1 megabytes. So that's obviously over our 50 megabyte limitation. And so here is an example of why it's so important to bake down your textures and to simplify your meshes if you're trying to upload online or put this in a game engine, because the sizes of our models are going to vary vastly. So 13.5 megabytes is actually still a little bit big depending on files you want to save. It's not that big because according to our modern technology now with the computers we have, it's really not that much. But if you were to send this in an email or send this over some sort of FTP, that might be a little large for some older computers. It's under 25 megs, so that means you can send it as an email attachment, so that's not bad. If you needed to upload this to the cloud using a Google Drive or a Dropbox or something, it's going to go pretty quickly if you have a decent internet connection. And so this is a good example as to why we want to reduce the file sizes and the texture sizes of our images, because you can see we still have a great result here. And this is something that we could throw in a game engine, or we could use inside some sort of live application. This would be great for VR. It could be great for a game. And so this is exactly what we're trying to accomplish, is to simplify that model down to a reasonable level of geometry. And maybe we could even reduce this even more. You know what? Let's experiment just a little bit. Hit add modifier. We're going to go to decimate. I'm going to decimate this down even further. And in fact, how far can I push this? So you can see if I go too far, obviously it's starting to tessellate Pikachu in some very strange and perhaps disturbing ways. However, I can kind of get away with decimating this down to like 0.25-ish. You've seen there's a little cut in the eye area there. So we're going to triangulate this and be a little bit symmetrical. I can go down to, I don't know, if I wanted to avoid that cut, it's going to be hard because it's kind of just putting it right there. But if I didn't mind that cut there, I could get this down to like 0.25 maybe, 0.25%, which is, honestly, it still looks like a Pikachu plushie. Like, that's not bad. There are some artifacts here, so maybe 0.27. I could also try to unsubdivide it and try the number of iterations on that. Which, of course, unsubdividing this is not going to do a whole lot because it's triangulated, maybe even planar. So planar is obviously not going to work because, okay, if we do it by UV, we can do that. So now we can really limit this down to something small. And like we have like what, 870 vertices now? That's really nice. That's really compressed. Obviously now we're starting to lose some of the silhouette and it's starting to look a little bit jagged. But all things considered, like we really could get away with kind of pushing the limitation of this decimation and get this down to really small and reasonable counts. So I don't know, maybe something like that. Let's say 0.33. Just to give us a little more of that information in there. Make sure this is smooth shaded and hit apply. That's small, that's manageable, and that's great. We could use this inside of a VR application. We could throw this in a game engine and it's going to run super fast and it's going to work with other pieces of geometry. And that's the sort of optimization that we want when we're working in this way. And so now all I need to do is save this. Let's take one more look at that file size to see how small we've really truly gotten it. And now we're down to 11.6 megabytes. Now that's small. That's what we want. That's really good. So now if we're happy with the file size, we can upload this thing to Sketchfab. So let me get that set up on the side over here. So I'm going to pause the video. And once I get into Sketchfab, I'll resume the video and show you what it takes to upload this sort of thing. All right, so here I am on the Sketchfab page. You can see that they've got a Black Friday sale going on because that's the time of the year. You can always X out of these if you don't like seeing this stuff. You're going to have to sign up for a free account. If you use a university ID, I believe you can get a free premium account for a limited amount of time. I'm not sure if they're still doing that. You'd have to check. But if you have a university email before, I happen to know that if you signed up with it, you could get a free kind of professional Sketchfab account, at least for a limited time, which allows you to upload more stuff and have less limitations on the things that you upload in terms of how often you can upload, or perhaps even the size. I think maybe they expand that, I'm not sure. But for all intents and purposes, a free account will work for this. Simply hit upload. And it'll say drag and drop or browse. They support FBX, OBJ, DAE, Blend, STL, etc. You can also zip up image textures with an OBJ and put that zip file in here. It accounts for different types of archive files. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit browse, and I'm just going to look for that Pika final.blend, that 11.8 megabyte tiny file that we created, and just hit upload and hit continue. And so what that's going to do is that's going to create the model name. So let's just call this Pika plushie, and it's going to upload. Give me a description of what it is. So this is a plushie Pikachu. Now, for those of my students who are in class and want me to have a better understanding of this description box can be a real help for you. So make sure that you give me a good description if you want me to better understand your project, and that could really help your grade out. Here we have categories. This is for discoverability. You don't have to do any of this stuff if you don't want to. This is kind of like your social media or search engine optimization type of stuff if you want people to be able to find your object faster. You don't have to do that. As long as you get me the link of the published model, I can grade your assignment. And then for those of you who just want to upload to Sketchfab, you can do whatever you want for this. It's completely up to you. So once I'm happy with that, I'm going to hit continue, and it's going to begin processing. So as this processes, it may take some time. Fortunately for me, it goes very quickly for some reason. I guess my internet connection's good or something. And for some reason, it looks like the texture didn't come through, and I'm not sure why. So there's a couple ways that we can address this in case you run into the same problem. Maybe there's a problem with the way they managed it or something else. We'll take a look. But before we do that, you need to know that Sketchfab has a new upload credit limitation, and so models set to downloadable do not count towards your upload limit. I believe you are able to upload one model that is not downloadable per month on Sketchfab. If you want people to download it, then use free, and then you can change the licensing. So for example, it's set to Creative Commons attribution. You can say non-commercial, no derivatives, and share alike. And so you can kind of choose the way that Creative Commons attributions license is kind of limited. And so, you can select those, and if you want, make it free for download. If you are one of my students and you want to give me the ability to download your model so I can inspect it further if I need to, or if you need help with it, then, enable that option. If not, then you can use your one free upload credit to upload your model for the class. And if for some reason that you run into a problem and you need to re-upload it, then you can either remove this, I believe you can remove this and upload a new one, or you can re-upload the model in the 3D settings so that you don't have to waste your upload credit. I believe that's how it works, but I'm not entirely sure. But you always have the ability to upload a free downloadable model if you so choose. So it's up to you how you want to manage that. I leave it to you. Lastly, there's the store option where you can sell your 3D model, but you have to be a seller under Sketchfab's program, which I believe has an application involved with it. So just keep that in mind. So I'm just going to say no download. I'm not actually going to publish this, but you are going to publish it if you're my student, and you're going to send me that link so I can create your assignment. So before we do that, though, let's take a look at these 3D settings. For some reason, my texture didn't show up, which usually it should when you upload the Blender file. It'll be, so I hit the 3D settings, it'll be under the material settings. So here we have bake. For some reason, it just didn't show the texture. So I'm going to hit this and hit import texture. If you manually need to import a texture, this is how you do it. So essentially here, I'll walk you through this. So here, when we show up here, it's going to be on scene. We go over to the materials tab, find the material here. This should only be one. And then we can go to base color and we can say texture. So by default, it'll be color. We'll say texture, manage textures, and then we'll upload the baked texture. Just leave everything to default. And then we just want to turn all these other settings down, because we don't want to have that. We'll leave this roughness setting alone though. It's just all these metalness, specular, we're not going to deal with those. And then in the lighting setting, what I would suggest is, actually in the scene settings, I would suggest changing the shading from lit to shadeless. And that'll just kind of give us some flat shading like we were expecting in Blender. And then one thing that I personally like to do is I like to turn on ground shadows, and what that'll do is it'll take a second to calculate, or it should anyways. Baked AO. Okay. So turn on ground shadows and then switch over to baked AO. And what that'll do is it'll take a second to render. And what it'll do is it'll place a little shadow underneath Pikachu's feet as if there were a floor underneath him. And that's something nice. You can also set a background. So set as background, and you'll see the background has changed. And you can change some of these background images that give it a little bit of color and a little bit additional life if that's what you choose. And so maybe you want to present Pikachu in a world of color. It's completely up to you how you want to do that. So I think perhaps something with a little bit of green in it will work, and that should be fine. You can also rotate the orientation of the background around him and change the brightness of it if you think it's too dark. I think that looks fine. And there we go. So if we're happy with these settings, hit Save Settings. And then if you're one of my students and you need to give me this file, you need to make sure that you hit the Publish button. And what that'll do is this will publish it on your Sketchfab account with a link, and you need to give me that link. So whether you go to the link and you copy it out of the bar up here or whatever, make sure that you hit this Publish button first and then send me the link in an email so that I can grade your assignment. I cannot stress enough, you must publish your project and send me the link to it. So many students end up not hitting this Publish button and thinking that they can share this link up here with me as if I will get the model, and if you do not publish it, it doesn't matter. I can follow the link and it's going to tell me that the project is unpublished and I don't have access to it, and therefore I can't give you a grade. So please, please, please hit the Publish button and send me that link. All right, I know this has been a really long-winded video. I hope this has been helpful to you. If you have any questions, please leave your questions and comments in the comments section. Send me an email if you're a student. I'm more than happy to help you get through this. And then, of course, if you're interested in the more advanced workflow where I don't spend so much time going through all the minutia of it, then check out the advanced video, which I'll leave in the description. So I hope you have a great time simplifying your photogrammetry meshes. I hope you've learned a ton, and I look forward to having you in the next video. Thanks so much for watching, and I will catch you later. Take care, and have a great Thanksgiving. Bye.